Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
With us today is Jeremy Miller. Jeremy is a senior software architect at Calavista Software. Jeremy began his software career writing shadow IT applications to automate his tedious engineering documentation, then wandered into software development because it looked like more fun. He was right.
It was a low bar.
So, Jeremy, before we kind of get into the meat of things, would you give our listeners maybe a little introduction to yourself, like tell them how you got started in the industry?
Yeah, not really accidentally. So I came out of school with an engineering degree, even though in retrospect, I clearly enjoyed every class where we got to write code way more than the actual engineering. And worked for a good engineering company, but engineering itself is pretty boring. It's a lot of paperwork. And this was right as the very first .com boom is starting to take off. So I found every possible excuse to write little software programs to automate engineering work. And this is right at that magical time when everything was still paper draftsmen, and they were just barely starting to move to electronic systems. So there's just all kinds of low-hanging fruit of ways to automate things, tracking materials. That was enough to teach myself classic ASP and Office VBA and a little bit of Access and Oracle. And I was able to turn that into a real programming job. And kind of the rest was from there. So I've been in .NET since the very beginning, since .NET 1.0. Even used web forms, hated it immediately, and stayed in .NET more or less ever since.
So what are you working on these days? What's like a normal day for you?
Well, so actually we're wrapping up my very first ever Node.js project. The last couple of years with Calavista Software, mostly helping clients with .NET applications, a lot of integration, a lot of asynchronous messaging, retiring some tech debt, introducing automated testing. About to start another client, real excited with a client in a couple weeks, and we're going to help them. They're one of the very first adopters of Marten that we're going to talk about in a minute, and just going to help their system go a little bit better.
Awesome.
So since you brought it up, what is Marten? I know that we've brought you on. We're going to talk a little bit more about Marten, but maybe give the listeners just a brief introduction as to what Marten is, what it might be used for, and why it's useful.
Sure. So Marten, and it's with an E. So Martens are little weasel-like creatures I had honestly never heard of until we called it Marten. So Marten with an E, it's a client library that allows you to treat the PostgreSQL database as a document database and also as a pretty full-featured event store with all the fixins. So it's a very different animal, but you could almost treat the Postgres plus Marten combination as a replacement for EF Core plus SQL Server. We can get into why it's on top of Postgres and why it's not yet on top of SQL Server later. But what it does is it stores, it takes your objects, and instead of trying to map it to relational tables, it just serializes in JSON, shoves it in the database. So there's much less work to define what the schema is going to be. The schema changes less often. It's a lot easier to change your code. If you get into systems where your domain model is very deep, where you might have a parent order that has order details and so on and so forth, all those places where it starts to get ugly and slow to do object relational mapping, with Marten, you're just stuffing JSON, serialized JSON in, so it becomes very fast. And on top of that, to make that useful, because it's .NET, they've got a full link provider, and then you can also treat it as an event store.
Now, I'll say I grew up as a relational database user. Started my programming career after, I guess, that battle was at least temporarily settled in the 90s. So I have had somewhat of a difficult time reconciling when and how to use a document DB. We have several applications that are actually using Cosmos, and then I've also used Mongo and a few of the others, but I always find myself using them as relational databases, which is not, okay, well, I don't even know. It's my understanding that is not entirely correct. When would it be a good idea to use Marten over, like, say, SQL Server?
Sure. Well, so it's really relational databases versus document database. I think is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
So, on one hand, if your application is a lot of ad hoc reporting, you stay with a relational database. You don't mess with it. If you're building off of like a CQRS kind of architecture or any kind of domain model, I think where the domain is richer, deeper, thinking like I've worked with financial trades in the past, and this is before we really had document databases. And the way that you model financial trades, there's so much polymorphism, there's so many relationships within one trade. It's easier to treat that as more of a structured document rather than trying to break that into rows and tables. So I think I'd be looking at what kind of problem domain you have and what your domain model is going to be. Lots of polymorphism, lots of deeper documents. You go with the document database. If you need to care a lot about the relationships between things, mapping, saying a person as part of a class, as part of a teacher, relationships, that's probably more relational. Document database, if you're using some kind of domain-driven design and you really can break things down into aggregate roots that are independent of other types of aggregate roots, then a document database is perfect. And places where it's kind of gray in the middle, like simpler CRUD systems, then I think I'd actually say it's preference. I still think document databases can be lower friction, but at that point, it's whatever you're most comfortable with.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of like back end business applications tend to be that kind of CRUD. It's just go get some stuff, put it on the screen, let some people see it.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would encourage folks to think about is, thinking about a CRUD system is remembering how much work is it to go through the wormhole. If you have to add one field to the database all the way to the screen, how many things do you have to do? Go add a database migration, go add the mapping to URM. If you're using Marten, if you added an extra field to an object, the JSON serialization is pretty forgiving. That's it, you're done.
So it just kind of happens. You don't have to. There's no. You don't got to talk with the DBA or anything like that.
No.
Because those people.
There's another point in front of Marten.
Yeah, I was catching up and refamiliarizing myself with Marten and looking at what's available and looking at the documentation on the website. And watching, I think, a presentation from the .NET conference in 2018, and it looks like you gave a pretty good in-depth kind of getting started, if that makes any sense. So say we've done our due diligence and we think that a document database is the way to go. We think that Marten is the way to get there with our .NET Core, .NET 5 application. What does it take to get started with Marten?
Well, so, probably honestly, the biggest piece of friction is, are you comfortable using Postgres instead of SQL Server? And that's probably our single biggest problem with adoption. But let's pretend you can get past that. At this point, with the latest Marten, and this is going to be extended a little bit with our V4 working on hard now, we take advantage of just pretty standard host builder extensions. I think hopefully as more people are familiar using the host builder, the older web host builder, those hooks to the now the standard DI registration hooks. So Then you spin up your host builder, you'll say add Marten, and a little bit of configuration from there, which the very minimal bit of configuration is going to be just the connection string to Postgres. That'll do enough. That will get the necessary services injected into your DI container. That'll get the high-level document store itself. If you have folks that are maybe a little more familiar with Hibernate versus EF Core, so document store would be the equivalent of the old Hibernate session factory. And then that would also give you the ability to do a per HTTP request document session. That's the unit of work for Marten. So that would actually be more analogous to either the old Hibernate session or the EFDB context. And all of the terminology, if folks are familiar, all the terminology was originally stolen from RavenDB. We've gone on from there, but that's where Marten was originally built as an in-house replacement for RavenDB at a former employer.
Yeah, it's Ayande Raheen, right? I think that's his name.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I haven't heard anything about Raven in a while. Sounded like a cool product, but
they're still going. As far as I know, so I've been out of it for a couple of years. I think they're drastically improved from where it was when we deviated off. But at the time, we did have some trouble with it. The humongous advantage we have with Marten over what we had at the time with Raven is Postgres is completely transactional. With an exception of some eventual consistency if you're doing event sourcing. But if you save a document in Marten because it's Postgres, you can immediately turn around and start querying on that. Something like you guys brought up Mongo and then Raven, some of the other document databases, they have what they call eventual consistency. Mm-hmm. So the writes are committed. The reads, you got to wait for some little background processing to build up the indexes. The killer advantage with Marten sitting on top of Postgres is it's all transactional. You can turn around and run link queries against what you just submitted. So that's a lot of problems that developers have using some of those other tools that can all go away with Marten on top of Postgres.
That's pretty cool.
So this is a more of a Postgres question, I guess. I haven't done much with Postgres. Is it like SQL Server, where there's kind of like a server that's in the lead and it's the one that gets talked to, and then there's some backup servers and they only take control if the lead server goes down, or does it have some other? Well, because the reason why Mongo is eventual consistency, right, is because it's distributed, and you could get your reply from any number of Mongo servers you've written to server A, but server B might be the one that responds with the data that you've asked for, right?
Yeah, and you need to talk to you're going to have to talk to a real Postgres person about how efficient the native Postgres sharding. I believe they can with the scaling and the Citus add-on. I believe they can scale horizontally, and that's what we made our bet on. But shame on me. I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
That's all right.
And you had mentioned that you've got another major release coming in coming months. Hopefully, be out there soon so that we can start kicking the tires and see what the latest and greatest is. What are some of those features that we can maybe look forward to?
Well, so the there's some alphas out now. So we're working hard. The whole Marten community and I are working hard on what will be V4. It's not just new features. It's running back through almost everything it did. And we kind of redesigned a lot of the internals. Took a shot at wherever possible, reducing object allocations, just having it do less, fewer dictionary lookups, fewer object allocations, finding every possible way to apply some micro optimizations to the stuff you just do all the time. On top of that, the biggest set of features we're working on right now, I'd originally just kind of thrown on some event sourcing functionality into it that's kind of like, hey, this would be kind of fun, just threw it over the side. That became popular, unfortunately. And so we're scurrying around trying to make that much more robust. So I'm not, how familiar should I assume folks are with event sourcing?
Why don't we spend just a few minutes on it and make sure that we've got all the listeners up to speed?
Yeah. Well, and then y'all see the challenges pretty fast. So with event sourcing, instead of having like the one true model that is somehow persisted to database tables or with Marten through JSON, what you capture on the read side are the events. So we just worked on a system for for a client where we did it this way. It was Node and Postgres, but same concept. You're capturing the events, the change in status. It's valuable in this case to have. It allows us to take that raw data of I changed this, then I committed that, then the person. So this was a telehealth system. So when is a patient ready? When did the call start? How long did it last? So you can take all those events and you can do things like replay at 2:00 on Friday. Exactly what did the state of the board look like? How long are all these calls taking on average? So all this kind of statistical data, this rich data that's there by just capturing and persisting these events, and that's fine. But somebody always wants to see a compiled list of what does the world look like right now? What is the current state of the system? These events aren't very helpful. Go turn that into now a representation of the current state. Even though that's not the source of truth, just give me a representation of it. So most of the challenge is not in the initial capturing the events. It's capturing the events, and then also let's keep up to date a read side view, projected view of the data. So we're working on really hard. Marten's had some capability for these projected views. To some point, you can do these either say, I want to aggregate these live. So if there's 100 events, just go apply these all and build me up a representation. Maybe you want to do that if you're doing lots of writes, few reads. That's something unusual that Marten does. Another unusual thing Marten does is it'll let you rebuild these events as these projected views as they come in line. Same transaction, just using Marten documents as a store. That's all great. The third way is if hundreds of concurrent threads are updating related events and you want to keep some kind of updated view of the world, maybe constant summarization of everything that's happening, everything that's current, you've got to be building asynchronous projected views. As events come in, know that they're coming in, make sure that nothing's processed out of order, making sure you don't miss anything through the events, and apply those events through to projected views in the background. So a lot of my work in the last couple of weeks and this week is finding ways to improve the throughput of all that stuff to make sure it doesn't lose data, doesn't get out of order. The big one for us, we've had this capability, but it was 100% on you to make sure that it only ran on one box. So any legitimate system is going to be clustered. So designing up a system where we could look at the projected views, maybe find ways to split it out. Maybe you're doing it by tenant, by some other kind of thing, and do some leader election where you can spread work across your cluster and then also be able to fail if something goes down, make sure it fails over and without ever coming out of sync. So that's where all the challenge for Marten v4 is at this moment.
Okay, some of what you were talking about reminded me of a database I heard about a while ago called Datomic. So I don't think he used the term event sourced, but he would basically return these little, I think he called them atoms or something. But when you would say change this record in the database, it wouldn't update the record. It would just add a change event. Mm-hmm. And then the database would compile the change events to get the current state. But you could, one of the selling points was that for debug purposes, if you knew that at 3:23 and 18 seconds on Friday morning, there was an issue that happened in production and you want to reproduce that issue because you know what event was fired that triggered the issue and you know when that happened, you could basically snapshot the database at that exact point in time, run the event through, and then debug the error. Is something like that possible with V4?
Yes. Well, it is with V3. It'll just be way better with V4. Yes, not to the extent you're talking about. There's an add-on for Postgres called Timescale that will give you that exact same kind of capability at a Postgres level. That's more generic. But with Marten, and this is something, I was part of a startup that used event sourcing it was to have better governance over operating rooms. So recording all the events of the doctor's ready, the patients at this point, and be able to take all those events and show you the board of what did the operating board look like. But take all that data and say, what did it look like at 2 p.m. on Friday when things started to go really slow and we started getting delays in the operating room? And by moving it forward and backwards and even playing it, you could allow an anesthesiologist to kind of suss out, where did we systematically go wrong? Why did these delays start creeping in? So yeah, event sourcing is perfect for that kind of historical analysis like you're talking about.
Okay, that's awesome. That was one of the things I wanted to look at with that Datomic database, but it cost lots of money, and it wasn't for my language. So,
well, and again, there's timescale. Timescale with Postgres would, I don't know if it works the exact same way, but timescale would let you do temporal querying against Postgres.
Okay.
You had mentioned the struggles for getting this to work with Microsoft SQL. What would you like to elaborate on those a little bit?
Yeah, it's inevitable we'd ask, or somebody helpfully points out people would use this more if you put it on SQL Server. It's kind of like we know. So Postgres is way out in front of every other database with their JSON features. I think we could I think at some point, hopefully in the next year or two, we'll have a version of Marten that runs a subset on on SQL Server. But Postgres has a really unusual data type they call JSON-B that stores JSON, really parsed JSON in a binary format. So it's faster to search through, probably takes up less space. On top of that, you can run JavaScript inside of Postgres. So we do have some capabilities in Marten where you could use JavaScript either to do documentation transforms or, here's a funny one. Did any of y'all use AutoMapper or anything like that in your .NET work?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So I'm about to make fun of it. Sorry, Jimmy. So you think about the work you do today to write a web service. Say you're backed by EF Core and you're using AutoMapper and all that good stuff. So you issue your HP request, and what you have to do is reach into EF Core, and it's got to go get a bunch of related data, spin it up into those objects. Then you're going to take AutoMapper on those objects and put it into different DTO objects, and then finally serialize the whole shebang down to JSON and down the HTTP pipeline. So with Marten, in some places, especially like projected views of the EF, if the JSON document is close, it at least has all the data you want, what you could do is fetch one JSON document, but don't fetch the real thing. You can apply a JavaScript function inside the database to transform it in one shot to exactly the representation you want to go over the wire. And then don't even serialize it. Just grab the JSON, let Postgres give you the transformed JSON that you want, and shoot that right down the HTTP pipeline. One feature we've talked about for years, we haven't built yet in V4, but I swear we will this time. We'll have a feature where you can do that, but don't even bother going to string, the JSON string. Just let it stream byte array right down to the HTTP response. And That way, we'll give you a vastly more efficient read side HTTP web service than you could possibly get with that EF core spinning up and AutoMapper and then serializing.
That sounds cool. Yeah, very cool.
And you've mentioned a couple times that it's you and the team and the community. Marten's an open source project? Is that correct? You have
It's an open source project at MIT. So we have a very active. When you find us on GitHub, you'll find links. We have a very active Gitter room. You can ask questions on GitHub itself. We're using GitHub, the new discussion group stuff on GitHub, like that. But there's a Gitter room that's really active. So there's myself and there's 3 other core team members. I'm going to let you go look them up. I butcher their names too badly. But the important thing there is, no, it's not just me. It is a community. A lot of contributors right now. We've had over 100 contributors all told, and that's a huge number for a .NET project. Nothing for like a Node.js project, but it's pretty good for .NET.
So in addition to Marten, do you have a lot of open source projects that you work with or work on, or are you in charge of multiple different projects? I think you had mentioned another GitHub IO page for Jasper.
Yeah. So I'll run them down super fast. So I'm probably best known, for better or for worse, for Structure Map. That was, once upon a time, was the original production IOC tool for .NET. That's been passed by years ago. I've got a project called Lamar that's a next generation successor to Structure Map to get people off Structure Map. A couple other tools, a command line parser called Oakton, a tool for testing HTTP contract testing on .NET called Alba. That's a wrapper on test server, makes a lot of testing scenarios easier. But other than Marten, the biggest project I'm working on, have for years, is something called Jasper. So Jasper is, it was originally meant to be another open source service bus model. But I feel like it has a very strong in-memory command processing model. So I would say it's probably analogous to Brighter or Mass Transit or In-Service Bus, but used completely in memory. It could also be used as a superset of that really popular Mediator library, where people don't like to have so much functionality embedded into their MVC controllers. But Jasper at the very least can do that. It does a lot more stuff after that for running commands.
Okay. Yeah, mentioning AutoMapper and Mediator in the same conversation, I think Jimmy Bogart's going to jump out of the screen at some point.
So years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, actually a bunch of us were at a little one-off project conference in Dallas. I'd gone upstairs. There's just 2 talks, one upstairs and one downstairs. And when I went upstairs, they were actually kind of making fun of an older OSS project I did called Fubu MVC that failed. I don't want to talk about it anymore. And I just got, this is kind of frustrating. And I walked down, and Jimmy Bogart was doing like an experience report on AutoMapper. And the very first thing I hear him say is, well, this is one of the worst mistakes I made with AutoMapper. See, I took this idea from Jeremy Miller and Structure Map. And he was right. He was definitely right. Sorry about that, Jimmy, but yeah.
So zingers flying around all over the place, huh?
Yeah. It's a good thing that everyone's a good sport, especially Jimmy on AutoMapper. I think he takes quite a bit of heat from time to time. So I know that there's been a lot of discussion on Twitter and those types of platforms recently about the speed with which .NET framework core development is progressing and or not progressing. So some people say it's too fast for them to keep up. Some say it's too slow, that there's not enough innovation happening. Have there been? What are your thoughts on that? And are there features that you're utilizing in the latest and greatest .NET releases? Are there things that you're thankful that we have now? Are there things that you're still looking forward to?
Yeah, and I'm going to say, well, first of all, I do, unless the client is using a really old version of .NET, I'm doing almost all of my .NET development using JetBrains Writer, using a Mac. It's pretty rare for me to fire up my Windows VM. So being cross-platform, that's pretty cool. And then we've got an opinionated DevOps guy who would probably whine outrageously if he had to use Windows. So being able to run on Linux clusters. But what I would tell you, the biggest thing from .NET Core, besides being cross-platform, as much as I hated them for what they did at first, a lot of those very bedrock abstractions, we talked about the generic host builder. Now having one standardized way, I don't know that everybody's using it, but we're going to get there. Having roughly one standardized way to bootstrap up an application, to apply configuration. The configuration model that came in .NET Core, I think is much stronger. I think it's a huge improvement over what they had before. That's advantageous, but having that standardized, and I cursed the Microsoft people for the standard DI abstractions they did. They didn't talk to any of us. They didn't run it by anybody. They just threw it out there and expected all of us to conform to it. I'm mostly over being angry. That's been extremely advantageous. So now the generic host builder, things like the hosted service model, having a way to just throwing in things into a container, having a way to say, I want this little side remnant process to be started up and shut down cleanly as the app goes up and down. So that kind of standardization, people being familiar with that. Now, when you talk about something like Marten, and we finally just built it straight into Marten. Marten has extensions right off of the service collection to whatever kind of .NET Core application you're building, whether it's a web service, whether you're running a service worker. As long as you're using that host builder kind of model, you have a quick way to just say, add Marten, use Marten. And it's idiomatic. It's the same way, roughly the same way you use EF Core. Today, even things like mass transit, I assume in Service Bus, instead of having being their own framework, and now you have to have a Marten plugin specific for in-service bus, a Marten plugin to integrate it with mass transit. Now, if we're all standardized on that service collection, the host builder, it's much easier for us to build things that are more approachable for more .NET developers by standardizing how things are pieced together. Even though I was not necessarily happy about how they went about it at first, I think it's hugely advantageous.
Yeah, no, the early releases weren't nearly as feature complete or even approaching parity on framework. I think with .NET Core 3.1, I think we got most of the way there, and now with the reunification for .NET 5 and the LTS version, hopefully this fall for .NET 6, I think we're in pretty good shape.
And it's stabilized. It was a nightmare. The OSS projects I had that targeted like very early Net Standard 1, Net Core 1.0, the abstractions changed so much version to version. And this time going from 3.1 to the new .NET 5.0, it wasn't completely painless, but it wasn't that bad. So I think we finally arrived. We just need to get everybody to stop using old versions.
Here. So what resources might you point people to that maybe are looking to get started with Marten or utilize Jasper? Anything else we've talked about?
So the Marten website, martendb.io, we think is pretty complete. did just go through the exercise of asking lots of people, what would it take you to use Marten? And apparently my web design skills aren't that great. So someone else is doing a redesign of the website, but I think the content's all there. The biggest thing, if you're going to use Postgres, I'd really encourage people to be at least comfortable enough with Docker that you could use. I think we've got some sample Docker Compose files. Don't try to deploy Docker on your own box or anything. Just run it in Docker, shut it up and down. And there's images that'll have that the PLv8 add-on for the JavaScript support, which isn't mandatory, but it kind of trips people up. Get comfortable with Docker, and that'll make spinning up and shutting down Postgres real easy. I hope that Marten makes it real easy that you can just get in and start playing without worrying too much about database migrations and all kind of silliness. So the website, Docker, that's where I'd go from there.
I do love me some Docker. What would you say has been helpful in your career that you might share with those just getting started or those looking to level up their own careers?
Sure. Some things that have helped me. I mean, there's a time element to this, but I would say if you can, do some kind of side project, especially if it's something you can be kind of passionate about, something that makes you stretch your skills. Don't go running, don't go learn 5 languages and write a to-do app for 5 new languages. Do something that's going to challenge you and stretch. Beyond that, I think I would say try to focus on the fundamentals, fundamentals of design, fundamentals of OO, or now functional programming, the kind of conceptual things that generally carry you between languages or even new tools.
Cool.
And wherever you get the chance, try to put yourself in a position where you're around other developers that enjoy software development. It's just easier to learn if you can do a little bit of osmosis, just being around people that are interested and want to talk about it.
But pandemic.
Yeah. I was going to say, that's harder to do someday nowadays, but agree, totally. Where can our listeners go to keep up with you and maybe just find out what you're working on? Follow you.
So I'm not the prolific blogger I was years ago on CodeBetter, but you can find me today on jeremydmiller.com. Try to blog as much there as I can once in a while. Starting to throw a few blog posts up for Calavista as I can, and my coworkers will remind me I'm really late with the blog post right now. But I'm about to throw a big blog post up on going back. What is test-driven development? How's it different from behavior-driven development? And other double Ds.
Cool. Sounds like a good one.
Well, all right. Jeremy, thanks so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, guys, thanks for having me on. Thanks for reaching out.
All right, chat, hang on just 1 minute and we'll wrap up here and maybe hang out for a few more minutes and be respectful of Jeremy's time. So if you've got additional questions, and we'll address them in chat. So with that was Jeremy Miller. Jeremy is a senior software architect at Calavista Software. Jeremy began his software career writing shadow IT applications to automate his tedious engineering documentation, then wandered into software development because it looked like more fun.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
And be sure to catch us live each week on Twitch, and excuse me, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I am John Ash.
Fade to black and dropping. Turned it on.
I used Structure Map and enjoyed it quite a bit.
Good.
think?
I maybe used it once or twice. I didn't find out about it until pretty far into the Entity Framework game.
It was actually supposed to be an ORM. The ORM project failed miserably, and then I had this like leftover, way too fancy configuration system, and it became a DI container.
Yeah, I think I used Structure Map for a long time, then went with Ninject, I think, and then AutoFac after that.
Oh, you hit them all.
Yeah, and then I think we switched from Ninject to AutoFac because we were doing Ninject. We interviewed a guy that mentioned AutoFac, looked up the stats between the two, and switched them over lunch. So
I wrote my own. Mostly it was used for testing because there was no like DI for testing. So I ended up using it for that. Right now I'm using BUnit for testing dependency injection.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, BUnit was written by Eagle
Hansen.
Is actually for Blazor. But what he doesn't know is that I can use it for everything. And so I am.
You will.
But yeah, it does a test implementation of the dependency injection. It has it doesn't have built-in, but it is compatible with a HTTP mocking library. It has all of the base stuff that you would need for a Blazor application. Some of the entry-level stuff like memory cache and a few other things built in, ready to go. So it's pretty helpful so that you don't have to keep writing constructor new statements.
Gotcha.
Somebody ask a question.
Yeah, what are you spending most of your time on these days? Is it mostly open source? Is it mostly client work, or where does that balance come in? Or do you?
Well,
balance?
right now, just kind of in a magic spot where client projects have ramped down and the next batch hasn't ramped up yet. So I'm full bore on Marten right now, more than anything. But normally, I don't do as much OSS as I used to, but just when I can, which right now is a lot.
Nice. Yeah, it's nice to be in a spot. I'm assuming it's nice to have a little bit of downtime or downtime client time to be able to do some additional OSS stuff. Or
well, this is the first time I've had this kind of downtime in 2 years, so I'm loving it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I was just listening to our friends over at Coding Blocks. They did a podcast episode on the results from the GitHub. Results from the Octoverse or something, their kind of state of GitHub thing about all the stats and metrics around open source in GitHub ecosphere. And so I think they were saying that the stats that they were reading said that a lot of OSS contributions are done on nights and weekends because that's when people have time away from the day job.
Yeah, I used to be able to. I had several years where I got paid to work on OSS tools because the company was so heavily invested in it. And that's when my GitHub profile shows all those solid green bars. But
that reminds me,
that's rare.
I got to extract some of the tools I've written for work and make them open source.
Yeah, that was another one of my questions. You had mentioned that this kind of a fork, or at least in part, ideas taken from RavenDB. Is a lot of your OSS things that are useful that you need and just kind of taking an idea and running with it, or is it trying to be a product, trying to become a product and get funding and backing, or what does that look like for you?
It's been a lot of ambition without direction.
Mm-hmm.
No, from my side, some of my smaller things, The Oakton thing, the command line parser, is just something we wanted at the time. Alba is a spin-off of something. It's a piece of FubuMVC we built to test FubuMVC itself that turned out to be useful later. No, sadly enough, the big things were things I started. This is how I want to make a living. I want to make a business out of it. And it's just never taken off. With the exception now, through my employer, Cal Vista, we're trying to have a business line of see if we can use Marten as a way to get business. Kind of two birds with one stone. I get to work on a passion project, and we all get paid for it. If that can magically work out.
That would be nice.
Yeah, it would. I'll tell you in a couple of years if it works.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned kind of doing an offshoot or at least a subset that maybe might work with SQL Server. I wonder, since Postgres you said was so far out ahead of the game on dealing with the data structures that you need, is there a danger that you go to SQL Server and then people are like, oh, it's not performant, or it doesn't handle the things that it does handle with Postgres as a backer?
So there's some of that. I mean, it's things like Postgres, and I got to learn more about what's possible with SQL Server now. But things like Postgres has a really strong model for indexes within the JSON body. Mm-hmm. Something called Gen and just indexes that are just kind of overall kind of structured data, and then also being able to do calculated indexes within the JSON body. I'm not sure if SQL Server's caught up on that. I think we lose some of the JavaScript stuff that may be a thing. The big thing that's helping is there's a standard now, SQL/JSON, for databases to now have like an extension, kind of a standardized way to query JSON blobs inside of a database. It's all based around JSON path. Mm-hmm. So Postgres adopted it from V12, which is still newer than most people use. And SQL Server now supports that, and maybe some of the others. As they support that, then we'd have to retool our link support to use the SQL JSON operators instead of the weird special Postgres stuff. So there's a lot of work in Marten itself to every place where it's an odd Postgres stuff to either be using the generic DB stuff or using SQL JSON instead of the one-off Postgres stuff. And partially it's also waiting for people to adopt Postgres v12 and above.
Okay.
Postgres kicks out new versions much, much faster than SQL Server, so people don't keep up with it really well.
Are those the types of discussions that you're having on GitHub discussions?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
And you'll see that on Gitter, Twitter. I get asked that several times a year. Yeah.
Any idea what your adoption rate is? Like when you put out a new version of Marten?
Right now, all I can tell you statistically is I think we're averaging a little under 800 downloads a day on NuGet. I think we're coming up on 1.5 million downloads so far, but it's on but at least it's on an upward trend. So it's still accelerating. Hoping that the new version can help that a lot. I'm gonna try to see if we can start getting some companies, and there's a couple of government organizations that use it. See if we can start getting people to say yes, we use it. See if that'll help adoption.
Nice. It looks like you're part of the .NET Foundation as well.
Yeah. Just don't ask the silly questions like, what does that mean? How does it help? It does take care of some legal stuff I don't understand. It can't do any harm. I don't know what that's going to mean. Hopefully that's something that helps in the future someday.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, and chat, if you've got any questions for Jeremy, feel free to shout them out.
Yep. I'm going to turn on a fan.
I already turned mine on.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look at this. So I'm not familiar with Postgres, but I had it in my mind to actually start working on learning it. And so I have been working on a new side project, and was going to use Postgres as the back end for it, just as a new way to learn it. But I'll have to take a look at this. And it would seem to fit pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, when I first got into it, just maybe about a year before starting Marten, I thought it was pretty easy to get up and going. And it's SQL. There's some unusual stuff. There's a lot of features in Postgres you wouldn't necessarily expect, but SQL skills are going to carry through just fine.
Well, and if you use Marten, you don't even have to know the SQL skills.
You don't.
Just use your JSON skills.
But when you inevitably hit some kind of limitation of our link model, you can fall back on, you can do anything Postgres can do.
Yeah, I was going to ask that was, I guess if you needed something relational, is how much out of the, does that spin up another database, or is that within the realms of your tools, or just use the?
I think it depends, and this time I'm using that as a cop out.
Perfect. Hey, you're a consultant, so I
yeah. So you can use foreign keys between documents. I mean, but there's a point if you're wanting a lot of relational stuff, just use it as a relational database. One thing, some minor features we haven't gotten to yet, but we'd like to in V4 is have the best of both worlds. Have some ways that you use Martenized documents as your transactional model, and have some easy ways to either show flattened materialized views or write documents off to the side to flatten structure. So have your purely relational database for reporting and when you want it, but use Marten for document database for the transactional bits, and have the best of every world. But we haven't gotten there yet.
That would be pretty cool. Yeah, that would be pretty cool though.
Someday.
For sure.
All right. Well, we're coming up on the hour. I want to be respectful of your time. But Jeremy, really do appreciate you coming on the show. We are about 2 weeks out from releasing the episode. So we're looking at Monday, February 1st. We'll be in all of your podcast tools and things. Unless you've got something you'd like us to coordinate with, we'll plan for that.
No, fire away anytime you want.
Okay. And if there's anything that you need from us or anything that we could ever do for you, just be sure to let us know.
All right. Appreciate it, guys. Thanks for inviting me on. This is fun.
Yeah, thanks for
and
coming
with
on.
that, we will raid our friend over at Mastermindio. So with that, we will say goodnight, everyone. We will be back here on Twitch at 8 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday, January 20th. We're going to do some live coding on the live stream. So join us on Wednesday at 8 p.m. and next Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern for another episode of the podcast. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Yep, good night.
See you later.